Gute Woche and welcome to tonight's Shir. Thank you, Pinchas Rabin and Mrs. Rabin, for sponsoring today's Shir. L'Eirech Yom Shalom Toivus, your wedding anniversary, and much naches, and children, grandchildren, in good health. I'd also like to take this opportunity to ask everyone to join into a bracha, our full shlema to all those of our community who are suffering from COVID and from whatever else it may be, should have a full shlema or kroivo, be able to get back to their avodas hakodesh and in good health speedily. The fact that we're sitting here has got to do with COVID. That's how this whole shir evolved. And it's also because of COVID that we're here this month of Shabbos, because we still don't have permission to enter the United States. But meanwhile, just it certainly needs to make appropriate to mention about the Kinus HaShluchim and how by the Rebbe, Kinus HaShluchim was a very elated moment. All the idea of all this kinderlach who he had sent in all different difficult and challenging places to come together to celebrate together. So it's really a very special time. Let's go to our Shia and a bit of feedback from last week. We spoke about Chamar Medina, and just to remind you, the conclusion last week was that if you don't have wine and you have a choice between challah or Chamar Medina, as an alcoholic drink, let's say, and the balance was that by night you should make kiddush on bread, on the challah, and by day it's preferable to make kiddush on the Chamar Medina. That's the balance. So 2 points. One, which is feedback over here, and it may have been, I may have left the impression last week that there's no way you can make Kiddush on Challah Shabbos by day. But if you take a Tilos Hashem Siddur at the Kiddush for Shabbos day, it shows you the options of Ber Priagofen and Hamoitzi. Plus, I think it even says the Sabri Moronon. So there seems to be, and actually look in Shulchan Aruch, there is also B'Shas Adchak. If you only had bread, then you'd have Kiddush on bread by day also. So that's one side of it. That the preference to by day wine. If no wine, then Chamar Medina. If no Chamar Medina, then you'd bake on challah. By night, so the preference is wine. If there's no wine, then on the challah. And if necessary, it looks like Chamar Medina is also okay. So one of our regular listeners, a shliach somewhere in Europe, so he sent me 2 clips from the Sefer L'Shema Oizen. Now, L'Shema Oizen is a book of stories, recollections of the Chassid Reb Zalman Duchman, who passed away, I think, in the late 50s, perhaps a little bit later. But he writes 2 stories here. So one, I'm going to read them. I'm straight into English. I heard from the Chassid, the Gvir. There was a wealthy man in Warsaw, a devoted Chassid, Yosef Gurevich, that he and his son-in-law, Reb Feivel Zalmanov, Hashem Yimkein Domed, it looks like he perished in the Holocaust. This Yosef Gurevich happened to be also, he had another son-in-law who was a great uncle of mine, Label Raskin, and he also perished in the Holocaust. And I had an occasion to meet Rav Oshri. I'm digressing for a moment. Rav Oshri is the author of a series of Sforim called Mi Ma'amakim. And he was the Rav in the Kovno ghetto. And he wrote down, Mi Ma'amakim means from the depths, and actually part of it has been published in English. And he wrote the questions which he was presented whilst he was in the Kovno ghetto. So I met Rav Oshri, it's about probably about 35 years ago, perhaps a bit more. I met him at a Din Torah in the Lower East Side, and I was trying to help someone, and I introduced myself. So he says he remembers there was a Raskin in the Kovno ghetto, who, I'm mixing up with Kovnaget and Warsaw, or whatever. And he says that there was one, in his Sefer, he has a question, are you allowed to have Mesiras Nefesh not to remove your beard? The one who asked him question, that was Mendel Raskin, who was a brother of my great-grandfather. This is mixing up with Yosef Gurevich had a son-in-law called Label Raskin, and all right, let's come back. So they had come to the father-in-law and son-in-law, had visited the Rebbe, as in probably Rebbe Rashab, and they were in Oistland. The Rebbe had traveled out of the country, and they came to that resort where the Rebbe was. And so he instructed that they should come in to Makabel Shalom to greet. Friday night, they were invited to the Rebbe's table. It looks like they didn't have wine there. So the Rebbe said, it's not appropriate, I guess, to hold a knife whilst you make Kiddush. So he told them to make Kiddush on Mashke, even though he himself, the Rebbe himself, had actually made Kiddush on Challah. The next day, when they came, so the Rebbetzin asked him, did you daven? So he said, yes. So Ayoter gedavent, as ich kam übergelebt. He says, I just managed to survive the hangover from the making Kiddush and Mashke. So that's one story. The Rebbe made Kiddush and Challah, and he pushed them to make Kiddush and Mashke. Second story is the Chassid Pinchas ben Elichaim. So this is Althaus. And he heard from the Frierdiker Rebbe, Tate, it was once a Friday night, Friday before Shabbos. He told them that should boil the kettle, and they should bring it in. They brought in the kettle before Shabbos, and he took the kettle and he wrapped it between two pillows. That Friday night, they had a visitor, Reb Osher of Nikolaev. Those who remember Reb Shmuel Grossman, this was his father, a very devoted chassid. My father had finished saying the Maimer, and he said, he said Reb Osher should come into Bimkabel Shabbos. And he came to us for the Shabbos meal. The father told him, Rebbe Rashab told him to make Kiddush on Mashke. And then he told him to wash and have a kazayas challah. And then he told him to drink the entire kettle of hot tea, to drink the whole lot. Afterwards, my father said that Osher, Osher Nikolaever, he had an idea that he's going to fast from Shabbos to Shabbos. I guess that means with drinking a bit, but he fasted from that for the whole week, but he didn't. We want to do it on his own on his own bat. So he got into a carriage and he traveled to Lubavitch. When he came to me, he told me this. And he's ready on Wednesday. So I told him he should finish. So Moshe Nikolaev had been fasting a whole week, and now it came Friday night. So the Rebbe told him to make Kiddush on vodka, I guess, and then to have a little bit of challah, and then to have this massive amount of hot drink, I guess, to be able to that it shouldn't cause him any harm. So very beautiful stories. I think though they don't. I think they are yotzim in a klal rather than a klal, and so there were very how do you say, exceptional occasions where the Rebbe's told someone to make Kiddush on Mashke on a Friday night, but I don't think that's an indication to make it on a as a regular minhag. Okay, I do think most of the people on this conference call or this Zoom don't have a problem with that. Okay, let's go on to the next thing. So we did have a discussion about the Nekudas and have some very interesting feedback. I want to point out, you have at the bottom of the chart, or the Aleph base, we've got the series of the Nekudas. Now, in Dikduk, you've got the Nekudas are divided into Tenua Gedola and Tenua Ktana. How you translate that, master and minor, major and minor, however you pronounce, you can define that in English. So the Kometz and the Patach, so the Kometz is the major, and the Patach is the minor. Seire and Segel, So the tzere is the major, and the segel is the softer one, a and e. So segel. Also, you have chirik, can be major and minor. You can have in English, you say e and e. So e is a more stressed one. That's the major one. Chirik followed by a yud. The minor is just a e without a yud. Similarly with the u. So you have u and u. So food or food. So food would be in the minor, and food, good. We say good. We don't say good. So it's different words, a different pronunciation. So this is one is the with the malupum, with the vav with the dot. That's the major, and the one with the three dots. That's the minor. I know we're not always so fussy about this, but this is in Dikduk. You've got this hierarchy: five major and five minor. The cholam, the cholam is a major, and the minor of the cholam is what's called a kometz cotton. Now, for Ashkenazim, we don't make any difference between a kometz cotton and a kometz gadol. By the Sfardim, by them, it's a big difference, because the word kol or koil. So the major is koil. When it's shortened, like because it's hyphenated with a makaf, like kol davar, so from koil becomes kol. Typically, it's going to be followed with a hyphen. So the Sfardim, a regular comet, they pronounce a, but a kometz cotton, they pronounce o. So they will say kol davar. We would say kol dovor or dovor if you're really Ashkenazi, but they will have this distinction. So the Tnua Gdoil is the cholam, and the Tnua Ktano is the kometz cotton. In Tovshin Membeis, which I'm going to scroll to in a moment, the Rebbe spoke about this in the Sichos Rosh Chodesh Elul and Chai Elul. Before we go further, though, I want to show you a very interesting thing. In the name komatz, you have both vowels. You have the major and the minor, o a. In the word patoch, you have the minor and then the major, patoch. In the word seire, I pronounce it wrong. Yeah, it's seire. Yeah, so you've got the major and the minor. According to this, it should be the segel, should be segel. Okay. In literature, it sounds good. And then we have also, look at the word shuruk and kubutz. In the shuruk, which so it's first with the major, shuruk. And in the kubutz is the other way, it should be the other way around. It starts off with the minor and then with the major, kubutz. Okay, so just it's an interesting observation. And before we finish off, also the cholam. The cholam is oy o. So it starts off with the major and then with the minor. Okay, so now one of our regular listeners is Rebbunim Weinbaum, and he told me that when his first yechidus, and he just got married, and the Rebbe was like unexpected. The Rebbe was speaking to him about publishing and about various hoiros about publishing, and one of the things he had already been involved a little bit in teaching Aleph base in the Chadorim, Sunday schools. And the Rebbe so emphasized the union of to teach kometz aleph o in the traditional way rather than just o bavo. He published a book called Lamdeni, and this is in Tovshin Membeis in 1982, and it was in Sivan, 18th of Sivan approximately, where he wrote to the Rebbe about this, and a few weeks later he sent the Rebbe a color copy. Now this is how many years ago? 40 years ago. So color copies there then was quite a rarity. And he made a color copy and sent it to the Rebbe around, it must have been around Tammuz of. And it's shortly after that was this sikh is quite well known, especially those who are dabble in Dikduk, where the Rebbe spoke about, he was concerned about the Seder of the Nekudas. Why is it major, minor, kometz patach, Seire segel, major, minor, and then, so why is it the kubutz and the shuruk, It's the minor and then the major. That was what the Rebbe addressed at the Farbrengen. And he says, he's already, he was talking about the Menorah with the round branches, with diagonal branches. There's another thing which I want to address, something which needs to be corrected. And so he spoke about this on the Rosh Chodesh Farbrengen. And then in the footnotes, there's a comment that Al Pi Kabbalah, the sequence as it is here, Kubutz and then Shuruk, is correct because one is Hoid and one is Yesod. Don't ask me for more explanation of Pi Kabbalah because I haven't gone through that. But Al Pi Kabbalah, that is the sequence is correct the way it is in the Siddur. However, Al Pi Pshat, since you're teaching Aleph base and reading to little children, the Rebbe was still not satisfied. And by the second Farbrengen, he revisits the topic, and he says there was Dvarim Elo, then what I spoke about made a whole tumult. I was actually quite pleased that it made a whole tumult. And the Poyol, they were going to, there was actually one printing Kfar Chabad, they changed the table of the Likkudus. Later they went back to the original format, and so with the Rebbe's instruction to leave it the way it is. But there was a whole discussion about that. At some stage, the Rebbe apparently sent out a zettel to Mr. Weinbaum, Dr. Weinbaum, to check up in Pardes Shar HaNekudus. Now, so just, I don't think I have the Pardes on the screen, no, but the Pardes is a Kabbalah Sefer written by Reb Moshe Cordovero, who is the Rebbe of the Arizal, and he lays down things very clear. He's got a whole chapter. Chapter Chav Ches is about the Nekudus and their significance in Kabbalah, and I mentioned last week about Malachim, etc. So in the Sikha, he mentions about the Siman of Pituchei Chosom. If you want to remember a mnemonic of the 5 master Nekudus, so you've got Pituchei Chosom. So you've got Chirik, Melupum, Tseirei, Choilom, and the comets. There, I guess, is a comet's cotton, which is wait a minute. No, that's a regular comets. Yeah. So you've got there the 5 Nekudus are there, the 5 master Nekudus. So that's like copied from the Sikha. In the Pardes, he shows a mnemonic for the Tenuas Ktanos, for the minor ones. So he has no ta re yi kun. So the comets there is the comet's cotton. That's the minor of the choilom. The patach under the tes is the minor of the comets. The segel under the reish is the minor of the segel. The yud, without a yud following, is the minor chirik, and the kubutz under the kuf is the minor of the melupim. So you have the pituchei chosom is the siman for the major nekudus, the 5 major nekudus, and notare yukun is the mnemonic for the minor nekudus. So this is a bit of a feedback by Hemshech to last week's discussion about the nekudus and then being names of malachim, etc., which can be looked up in the Pardes in Shar HaNekudus. Okay, so here was a question that someone asked me last Motzei Shabbos. The 10th man walked out of shul in middle of Maariv, in middle of Shmoyne Esrei. Now, there's a general rule that if you had 10 people, when you started a unit, and the 10th man, and the 9th man even, so long as they're roiv, as long as you have 6 men still in the room, so you finish off the unit which you are in middle of. The question is, how do you define a unit? So, for example, if a person walked out on a Monday in middle of Shmoyne Esrei, you wouldn't be able to do Kriyas HaTorah. That's obvious, because Kriyas HaTorah is a separate unit. Here the question was, how do the units work by Maariv? Is Shemona Esrei a new unit, or is it part of from the beginning of Maariv? So let's read here from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, Siman Nun Hey. If this is Shachris, if during Birchas Krishma, number 10, the 10th man left, so they cannot. You can't do Chazor Sashatz because Tfilas Yudches Kedusha, because the Shemona Esrei ain't no him Yidim Kaddish Baruch. The Kaddish, which you said after Yishtabach, is a separate unit. The Shemona Esrei is a new unit, and therefore you wouldn't be able to do Shemona Esrei because Chazor Sashatz because you had 10 at Yishtabach and by Baruch. Then he goes on to Maariv. V'chein kayotze v'zeh be'arvis. Similarly by Maariv. Lo yoyma hakadosh ela'ach tfilas yudches. You cannot say the Kaddish after Shemona Esrei unless there were 10 b'tchilas tfilas yudches. So if someone had walked out in the middle of Emes ve'emunah, so then you could say the Kaddish after Yehashkivenu, but you couldn't say the Kaddish after Shemona Esrei, which tells you, but if he was there when they started Shemona Esrei, there were 10 at the beginning of Shemona Esrei, then you could do the Kaddish after Shemona Esrei and the Kaddish after, Motzei Shabbos, after V'hinoim V'ata Kaddish. So that's pretty clear from the Alter Rebbe, and the Mishnah Berurah says the same thing. I hesitated because I didn't remember this clearly. And why did I hesitate? Because we know that by Shachris, we go straight from Goal Yisrael, straight into the Shemona Esrei. By Maariv, we have a Kaddish, Hashkivenu and then a Kaddish. The Gemara says, Gula Arichta, Hashkivenu is a Gula Arichta, fine. But why is there a Kaddish there? And most other shuls, in Chutz La'aretz at least, they say a whole piece of Yirei Neinu with Psukim and then they finish off, I'll call Masav, an extra bracha. So I've read somewhere that originally there was a time that they would do Birchas Krishma in Shul, but they didn't do Shemona Esrei. They finished off after Birchas Krishma, they said 18 psukim, corresponding to the 18 brachas of Shemona Esrei. After they finished the 18 psukim, then they said Kaddish, and everyone said good night and went to their respective homes. So because of this, it bothered me that in my mind that Efshatake, that's the Kaddish after Hashkivenu is the end of the unit, and Shemona Esrei is a new unit. Therefore, I was pleased to see that the Alter Rebbe addresses it pretty clearly, that if there were 10 who at the beginning of Shemona Esrei at Maariv, then you can say the Kaddish after Maariv. The Mishnah Berurah, as you can see on the other side, if there were 10 when the beginning of the quiet Shemona Esrei, you can say the Kaddish afterwards, and he spells out the Gam, also the Kaddish after Kaddish on a Motzei Shabbos. And in the Mishnah Berurah says so in the footnote, and he has in the Sha'ar Tzion, he is saying, this is how I paskin, contrary to the Chai Odom. So at the bottom of the page, you have here the copy from the Chai Odom. He says, by Maariv, if you had Baruch, you had 10, you can say the Kaddish after Ashkivenu. But you can't say the Kaddish after davening. So the Chai Odom, who was a contemporary of the Alter Rebbe, he says that if you had 10 at the beginning of Shemona Esrei, that doesn't allow you to say the Kaddish after Shemona Esrei. But the Mishnah Berurah doesn't agree with him. He says you can, and the Alter Rebbe, well, we saw already the Alter Rebbe says that if there were 10 at the beginning of Shemona Esrei, then you can say the Kaddish after Shemona Esrei. Okay, just clarified something. Okay, so now we have a shaila, a very, very common shaila, tragically, but can you count in for a minyan a man who's married, a Jewish man who's married to a non-Jewess? Now, if you're going to start looking in the various malaktim, this is not addressed clearly in Shulchan Aruch. You do have the concept of a person who has been ostracized, nidui, etc., and they cannot be joined for a minyan. So certainly the Sforim written 50 years ago, 100 years ago, are very strident that a person who's married out is considered is left Klal Yisrael, and we have this concept that like we had before, a person who's Mechal Shabbos, a person who's Eved Avodah Zarah, so they, as far as Kedushin and Gittin, they're considered as Jewish. But for all other practical inyonim of Yiddishkeit, they would write a Sefer Torah, do a Shechita, whatever it may be, we would not count their acts as an act of a Jew. So therefore, is a person who's married out, is he considered like a mumer who's walked away from Yiddishkeit? And so they take the view he's walked away from Yiddishkeit, and even the Minchas Yitzchak, who lived 50 years ago, takes that view. The reality, however, has changed. And whereas, let's say, 50 years ago, or certainly 100 years ago, if a person wanted to get married to a non-Jewish woman, the likelihood was it would happen in a church, and it would be a very strong statement of departing from Yiddishkeit. Possibly, I'm just venturing another svara, that the institution of marriage was a much more stable institution back then. Today, in the broader community, I'm talking about not Yiddish, the broader community, marriage is not seen as such a long-term arrangement, and for these various reasons, and this I have here in front of me, copied from a sefer called Umekar Vimin. It's a sefer all about kiruv. It's written by a fellow, not Lubavitcher, called Zakutinsky. I've been in correspondence with him. He quotes from the Minchas Yitzchak that even when you use the language of Tinik Shenishbo, that is being brought up in ignorance, but this is something which is so far out that even most Yidden will keep away from that. And he writes towards the end, though, that nowadays Jewish people who do get married to non-Jewish, they just think that marrying Jewish is a recommended practice. They don't see it as an absolute no-no. And on that basis, we can take a more sympathetic view. No, Rabbi Zukatinsky is not the greatest postic in the world, but I also have if you can see in the notes, there's a reference in the reference 4 to a note from Rav Auerbach, Rav Shlomo Zalman, quoted in the Mishnah Berurah in the Dirshu edition, where he also, Rav Shlomo Zalman is obviously one of the greatest poskim of the contemporary poskim, and he also takes a sympathetic view to a degree. I wasn't able to look up the source where he's quoted from, but certainly that's what is, I believe, followed in many Botei Chabad, etc., that if a person comes to shul, even though they are married to a non-Jewish woman, they will give them an Aliye, etc., and do whatever they can to be Makar of them. That's no question you have to be Makar of them. The question is whether you can give them, what's their status? No question about Kiruv. The question is what is their status? And so we would follow a more sympathetic status nowadays than may have been the practice back then. I see someone has put in here a question. Okay, okay, it's something for later. Let's go on to, however, the next question. There was a string attached. He's married to a non-Jewish woman, but he goes to church every Sunday, and he comes to shul. Can a person who is Poisea Hashnei HaSeifim, what's the story there? So this is a quote from Mishnah Berurah. But if a person is actually a mumer la'avedis gilulim, if he's actually an active Christian, he's in behaving in Christian behavior, then that would be much harder to justify that they should be able to be mitzaref to a minyan. Unless you say, whilst he's here, he changed his mind. But if you know that he's active over there, it's more difficult to justify
allowing to be mitzaref to a minyan. I once had a fellow here in the house. He had, this is 30, 40, 35 years ago possibly. He had spent time in Gateshead boarding school, and then he was told then that Yiddishkeit is like a hole. It's like you can't have half a hole, like a hole as an HOLE. And he had become a galach of some sort. He had other problems also, but yeah. But this is a problem, to be mitzvah of a person who's active in Christianity. I just want to throw in one more thing, that if a person was baptized and they want to come back, Baruch Hashem, there is an inyan of taking them to mikveh. In the last seif in Yeridea, when it talks about Geirus, there is a concept there of tevilah of a Baal Tshuva. And that's done particularly when a person had gone through baptism, so to take them to mikveh, and they make like a recommitment to Yiddishkeit in rejection in the presence of the best, and the best don't have to be at the mikveh afterwards. We had a few times, we had women or girls who went through this, and they come from Russia and come here. And this one of these girls told us how she feels such a tremendous relief after having gone to mikveh. She went with a woman, and then afterwards she stood, we brought into the front of Aron Kodesh, and she stood and made her commitment to Yiddishkeit. And Baruch Hashem, Ad HaYom, she's keeps a Yiddish house. There's actually also a letter of the Rebbe, which is published, I don't remember exactly where, a letter of the Rebbe to someone to do, and he says, the Rabbi, he apparently lived in Seattle, and the Rebbe says to get this mikveh done as soon as possible, and he tells him to contact Rabbi Levitin, who is a shliach in Seattle, to help him facilitate this tevilah as soon as possible. So this inyan of tevilah for a Baal Tshuva after baptism is something which is, if it's in where it's applicable, it's something which one should do ASAP. I want to share with you something. I have a colleague, Grace Fegelstock in Buenos Aires. So apparently in Southern America, there's witchcraft is still practiced, and when a lad has got his eye on a particular girl, he will use witchcraft to seduce her, that she feels like an obsession. She has to come after him. And they use it, and apparently it's so. There were some Yiddish girls were also ensnared in this kind of spell, and he was in contact. They came to him. He told them to go to mikveh, and after they went to mikveh, the spell kind of wore off, and they felt relieved of this pressure from this sheget who had an eye on them. Okay, let's go on to a totally new topic, and that is about Kriyas HaTorah. So there is a minhag written in Shulchan Aruch about not giving aliyahs to two brothers or father and son, one after the other. So this is in Shulchan Aruch. It's tucked away in Siman Kuf Mem Aleph. I'm going to read it for you. It says, you are min hadin, you are allowed to give aliyahs to two brothers consecutively, a son after a father. But it is not done because of ayin hara, of evil eye. Okay. Now, so therefore Gaboim know this, and sometimes they have to juggle, especially when there's a family simcha, lots of aliyahs, how to avoid having to give siblings or father and son one after the other. So now this is on the right. You have the Mishnah Brura. There's no Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kuf Mem Aleph. And he writes, there's no difference whether they are brothers from the same father, which then, when you call them up with the father's name, is going to be more evident that they are from the same, that they are brothers. Even if they're brothers only from the mother's side, also one would avoid giving them an aliyah one after the other. Even if the person says, I don't mind about it, I don't care about Menorah, but this is the minhag when doesn't. Then he says there are those who are machmer, even a father and a grandson also ein abisha, And if there's a tzorich, you can be makel on that. If there's a need, you can be lenient about a grandfather and a grandson. So that's on the right side. On the left side of the page, you have a quote from the Pischei Teshuvos, where he says that's a ben achar ben, a son's son. That's where there is a minig taking it further, being machmir, not to give one after the other. But if it is ben bitoy, if it's his daughter's son, then there's no problem of calling up Zayda and his grandson one after the other. Then he talks also then about a son-in-law and a father-in-law. Okay, but that's basically that. I've answered the question. Can a grandfather and grandson for consecutive aliyahs? So if it's through a daughter, then it's not a problem. If it's a son's son, so then it's something which the Chatchila would avoid. Let's go on. Now here's a question. A fellow is working in the shares, the stock exchange, that kind of job, and he has to be at work at 7 a.m. So now he has, especially now, and this coming week, we're going to change the clock. It's going to be a little bit of a relief, but he has a problem about davening, Tals and Tefillin, etc. What's the earliest you can do? Doesn't really have a private spot to take, a 10-minute davening break at his place of work, and I have to take in consideration that it might not happen. So what can he put on Tals and Tefillin early? So with the Tefillin, I'm much more at ease with this. There's a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he wrote this when he was still, before he emigrated to America. There was someone who needed to go to work at 5 a.m. and there was no possibility, talking about 80 years ago, more, 90 years ago, there was no chance of him putting on tefillin at work. This is in Russia, in Lithuania, whatever. So let's explain something. We don't put on tefillin by night. Is that a min haTorah or midrabanan? So machlokas tanoim, whether miyomim yomimo, the word miyomim yomimo means that you shouldn't put on tefillin by night. So some paskin that Lailo loves tefillin. The halacha where we follow is Lailo's tefillin. Why don't you wear tefillin by night? Shemo yishon behem, you might fall asleep, and once you fall asleep, then you don't have control of your body, etc. So Rav Moshe takes the view. He says, that's all very well. It's the middle of the night, but this fellow's got up to go to work. He's not going to fall asleep now. So he allows him to put on tefillin b'shas al-chag even before daybreak, before dawn. Then he asks an interesting thing: with a bracha, without a bracha. So he says, if he is a Talmud Chochem, he should put on tefillin without a bracha. If he's a simple person, not a Talmud Chochem, he should put on with a bracha. A Talmud Chochem, you tell him put on without a bracha, he'll understand. The lamdas, etc. A pashta person, you tell him to put on tefillin without a bracha, means it's not so serious. So he may skip it altogether. So this is Rav Moshe's advice. If he's not a Talmud Chochem, it's all time with a bracha. So with the tefillin, to put on tefillin early, certainly after dawn, I am more easygoing about. My shaila is about the talis. What is the earliest time you can put on a talis with a bracha? So we have a concept called Misha Yakir. It's a time when you can see the difference between the blue and the white in the talis. So what about earlier? You've got the time which is called dawn, alos hashacha, and then you've got the time of Misha Yakir, which is later. So what's the earliest, really when push comes to shove? So this is how you can see it's from the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch. We'll go through the Lashon. From what time can you make a bracha on the tzitzis? Some say from the point you can recognize the difference, to distinguish between the blue and the white in the tzitzis, because it says a re'isim oisoi, from the time that you can recognize the tcheles. Only then, so according to this opinion, before Mashiach here, you make a bracha on tzitzis, a bracha levatala. Kolponim. Okay. All right, it's not called everyone. Tosfos says it's beged yom b'layla is chayv. Okay. V'yesh oimrim. There's a second opinion says no, that actually from dawn is already called Sha'as Re'iyah, at least min haTorah, because from that point is actually you can see the tzitzis, even though you cannot differentiate between the blue and the white, and therefore already from dawn you can make a bracha because it's already a chiyuv. V'chein noi hagin. Wow, look at that. That the minig is to allow a bracha from alos hashachar. Not to put in the talis with a bracha until mishayaki between the blue and the white. But meanwhile, we've seen here something very powerful, that already from Alos HaShachar, you can already make a bracha if there's a need for it. Of course, there's another solution. He can make the bracha when he just at the end before he takes it off. But at any rate, we have here sound basis to be matir that he can make a bracha. And as I said before, a person who's not such a Talmud Chochem, you start telling him the bracha without a bracha, it may weaken the mitzvah in his eyes, and therefore we have here a heter to make a bracha from Alos HaShachar. And then there's another parsha. How do you work out Alos HaShachar? That's another discussion. Okay. Does a bread bin need to be toiveled? And so the rules of Tevilah, I'm clarifying this because people get confused. Minatoire, or the mitzvah of Tevilas Kelim, applies to metal. Midrabanon, it also applies to glass. Wood does not need to be toiveled. Earthenware is toiveled without a bracha because of the glazing. The glazing, and therefore there's a svara, it's called glass. But other than metal and glass, wood, someone asked me, but they have to toivel a wooden thing. And the answer is no. So now, but there I would just want to point to the word kalei seuda. Kalei seuda means utensils which are used for serving to the table, etc. So a bread bin is not a keli brought to the table. A bread bin typically is sitting on the side and you store bread in there. But, and therefore it's not really a kalei seuda. Additionally, many of us will put stuff in the bread bin only when it's wrapped in a bag. So it's a container of bags. So you don't actually put food directly in there. And on that basis, it doesn't really require a tevilah. If you actually put bread in without a bag, then it does. Then one should toivel it, obviously, without a brach. Now you might ask, what's this bag business? Does a bag make a difference? So as I was researching, it's very interesting. Well, sometimes people ask, what about a baking tin? But you always line the baking tin with grease-proof paper. Does that take away the need for toiveling the baking tin? And the answer is it does not change. Bread in a bag, you can carry the bread from place to place in the bag. So the bag of bread is a proper keli. The grease-proof liner of a baking sheet is not a keli for itself. You don't carry around cookies in a grease-proof liner. So therefore, that kind of lining does not, dispense the need of tevilah or the baking tin. Whereas in the case of bags which you contain bread or whatever, and you put that into the bread bin, so they are kelim b'fnei atzmom. So therefore, like you don't toivel a fridge, yeah. No one's asked me about toiveling a fridge. You put food in the fridge, but it's always in containers, yeah. So a similar idea, and you certainly don't serve food to the table from in a fridge. Okay, let's move on. So one of our regular listeners listens to the recording, and he came across some kind of YouTube demonstration about Shabbos with a cholent in a crock pot. And the rabbi who was displaying this, demonstrating, he took the crock pots have got an outer housing made of metal, and that's where the element is, the heating element, and then you got an inner ceramic insert, and he had taken off the ceramic and put it down on the counter. He was holding it with one hand, and he stirred it, where he added water. We went through this recently. He added water from the urn, and then he stirred it, and then puts it back. And the fellow was shocked, stirring a kli rishon, and he was always under the impression that you're not allowed to stir a kli rishon even when it's not on the fire. So here we have in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch and Mishnah Berurah, they both say the same thing, but the graphics are different. The Alter Rebbe first says, "Im disbashlu kol sorkon," talking about a pot which is fully cooked and it's taken off the fire, so then you are allowed to stir it. Then he finishes off, "V'yesh machmirin," there are those who are machmir with a pot even when it's off the fire. And the ikeh is like the first svara, the one who wants to be stricter should be machmir, mamish stirring, but to ladle out, that's okay. Now on the left side, you have the Mishnah Berurah. He says the same thing.
He says, "Afilu lohogis boy." He's talking about a klirishin off the fire. The ein bishul achabishul. Scroll down a bit in the Mishnah Berurah. You're allowed to stir it. So really, the same lashon which the Alter Rebbe wrote, he also has written, but it's not in the same seif. So here in Sif Kotten Kuftas Vav, it said that you're allowed to stir a klirishin which is taken off the fire. In later Seif in Kuf Yud Zayin, then he says, oh, there is room to be machmir. So that's why this rabbi who was demonstrating, he was taking kipshutai, that you are allowed to stir the cholent of the fire in the klirishin, but the one who learns the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, it's in the same Seif, and you go away the impression that we don't stir stuff in a klirishin even when it's off the fire. I want to just share with you another interesting experience. So in this demonstration, the rabbi who was holding, he had put down the crock pot, the ceramic, on the counter, and he was holding his hand. So about 30 years ago, I was learning Mishnayos Kira, and I was reading the Rambam, where when it says oide b'yodoi, that in one of the conditions of chazorah to be allowed to put it back on the heat is oide b'yodoi. So how do you translate oide b'yodoi? Does it mean that you haven't let go of it, or that you're still bearing its weight? And Shmir Shabbos Kilchoso, he had written that you don't have to hold it in the air. So long as you're holding it, you don't leave go of it. That's called oide b'yodoi. But the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos is very clear that he says oide b'yodoi means that you are bearing its weight in the air. You can hold it partly on the table, partly off the table, but if you'd leave go, it'd fall. That's called oide b'yodoi. So at the time, I wrote a letter to Rav Neuwirth, the author of the Shmir Shabbos Kilchoso, and I pointed out that the Rambam writes differently to what he writes in his Sefer. A couple of weeks later, I got an aerogram. If you remember those old aerograms, all folding over with the same paper. So I got an aerogram from Rav Neuwirth, Zechrein Levrocha. He thanks me for ha'ora ha'chashuva ma'oid, whatever. And in the next edition, he's going to include it. And he gives him a reference also, but he gave a reference to Damascus Eliezer, which is a Pirush and Bir Hagro, where he takes a perhaps a more lenient view. Okay, so that's about the stirring. Now I skipped from letters. I didn't have a slide for number 8, but I did. Wait a minute. Wait. We had 2-7. Sorry. All right. Okay. Right. So we have another couple of minutes. So now, someone pointed out to me that in one of the Hanukkah leaflets, it says that on Friday afternoon, the flames of menorah should last for 1.5 hours. And he's asking, where does the number of 1.5 hours come? And 1.5 hours is just 90 minutes. And we have, say, 30 minutes, the Chabad is 50 minutes. Where does the 90 minutes come? So let's first go to the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchos Hanukkah. It's already Shabbos Mevorchim Kislev. It's already you were talking about Hanukkah. So Simon Tofresh Ayin Base. So Mechaber says Ein Madlik. The time when it says in the Gemara, when is the time for Menorah? Mishetishka Hacham, from when the sun sets. There's an ambiguity here. Does it mean from the beginning of the Shkia or the end of the setting of the sun? So now the way the Mechaber, the Rabbi Yosef Karo writes, Elo im soif shkiyosa. The time for lighting the menorah is at the end of the setting of the sun. And then you leave it there for another half an hour until Kal Yal Rigdol Tamadoy, we see people stop walking the streets. So that is the opinion of the Mechaber. However, the Pri Chodosh disagrees. And he says, Mishetishka means from it begins to set. And he brings a loshon of Gemara, which I learned with my Malamed, my special Malamed of Ber Levin Olav Sholem. And it talks about blossoming and about cucumbers growing from what, I don't remember actually whether it's about Meiser, I don't remember exactly, but it says Misha Yifa Kesu, from when they start blossoming.
So Misha Yefakesu means from when it started. When it begins blossoming. So the same thing, Misha Tishka, means from the beginning of the sunset. So we have two opinions. When is Misha Tishka? From beginning of sunset or from the end of sunset? This is the background for the minhag, as you see here in Minhagi Chabad, where it says that we be medayik, that the menorah should last at least 50 minutes. What's the cheshbon of 50 minutes? Because the shortest time between sunset and 3 stars is approximately about 20 minutes. All right, you'd have mincha till you light it, whatever. It's about 20 minutes, and then you have another 50 minutes, another 30 minutes after that from soif. In other words, it's allowing from tchilas shkia to soif shkia, allowing 20 minutes. On top of that, another 30 minutes. And that's where the cheshbon of 50 minutes comes from. L'chayra. The footnote in the Sefer Minhagim I didn't put on the screen, was I found it confusing. There's a mistake over there, but fine. That's the cheshbon of 50 minutes. Now, in England, from sunset until 3 stars is not 20 minutes. It's more like half an hour, 40 minutes. It's much longer than just 20 minutes. Additionally, we're talking about Friday. Friday, there's Lichtzinden. Lichtzinden is 18 minutes approximately. We went through the whole thing about 23 minutes, but let's say if in 18 minutes before sunset. Then the menorah is lit even before. The menorah is lit a few minutes before Shabbos Licht. So we can assume that the menorah is lit about a half an hour before sunset. So half an hour before sunset. Then you have to have from sunset until 3 stars. And then from then you have to have another 30 minutes. So then the cheshbon of 1.5 hours, I don't think is exaggerated. So that's what I wanted to share to clarify that. Okay. Someone had asked here if I have time to address this. Can you use utensils from a dishwasher that was on during Shabbos Friday night? Okay, it's a good question, and I'm not going to deal with it now because there's a shaila here. If the dishwasher, I'll explain the question. The dishwasher was switched on before Shabbos, and then half an hour into Shabbos it switches off. The question is the door of during the onset of Shabbos, the door of the dishwasher was muksa. You weren't able to open it because it would mean switching off the machine. So since it was out of bounds for the onset of Shabbos, there's a svara it should remain muksa for the whole of Shabbos. But I'm going to put this onto the program on the agenda for next week. Bez Hashem, we'll be able to get an answer. Finally, though, the last point I want to share with you is a new thing, which was a new word from the Rebbe, new Giluyer, and that is that they found in Rabbi Gronel Shalom's archive, they found a record of when the Rebbe had gone to visit to be Menachem Ovel, the late Baba Rebbe. The Baba Ruv, Reb Shloime, had lost a child. And this is in Tovshin Yud Ches in 1958, approximately. Yeah, it was in the summer. And the Rebbe went to be Menachem Ovel. And this is a very, very interesting conversation, but this is the last piece. This was just now published. The Rebbe said the following. There are opinions that Nichum Avelim, that comforting the mourners, is a mitzvah min haTorah. And therefore, that entails a discussion, should you make a brocha? Now, it's interesting because you don't make a brocha normally on a mitzvah which involves a second party. For example, you don't make a brocha on Kibbud Av. You don't make a brocha on stock. There's another reason. You don't want the fellow to starve to death while you're putting on your gartel to make a brocha and giving stock. But generally, a mitzvah which is relating to someone else, we don't make brachas on. But meanwhile, there is a discussion whether it should make a bracha on Nichem Avelim. And therefore, says the Rebbe, therefore it's customary to associate Nichem Avelim with a tefillah. So the Baba Baruch said that actually we're going to daven mincha right away. The Rebbe then said that he has already davened mincha, but I'll stay for mincha. Which mincha, as you know, Galiciana davened mincha quite late. It was after the time for Maariv in our language. And it came late, and the Rebbe stayed for this late mincha, and he answered Kedusha. Reb Shmuel Levitin then related. Reb Shmuel Levitin was one of the very eminent Chassidim, and obviously he had gone with the Rebbe on this visit on the Nichma Velim, and he commented to the Rebbe that he had heard that when the Alter Rebbe was by the Barditcheva, Chutten, and the Barditcheva davened mincha very late. So then there was a shaila whether to answer Kedusha. That's what Reb Shmuel Levitin said, and he said he doesn't remember what the Alter Rebbe did, whether he did say Kedusha or not. To which the Rebbe responded, by me is ausgekommen. By me it makes sense that when Eden are saying Kedusha, it's impossible not to join in together with them. Very beautiful reaction of the Rebbe. Eden's on Kedusha, you don't make a lomdus, you say Kedusha together with them. What I find interesting here, and I'm not sure of the history exactly, is in Chabad we are particular to daven mincha before Shkia. Obviously, the Barditcheva wasn't noyeg, and we know that. All right, this following Rabbeinu Tam, etc. So possibly he was following Rabbeinu Tam's Shkia, and therefore he was davening mincha later. I'm just curious at what stage does the Alter Rebbe go all the way like the Goinim to daven mincha before the earlier Shkia, whereas his colleagues still were following the Shkia of Rabbeinu Tam L'Chayra on davening mincha later. By what I once read that there's a sefer of one of the Talmidei HaMagid called, I think, Menorah HaTahora, a halacha sefer, and he was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe, and he also, perhaps before the Alter Rebbe, he takes also very strongly the view to paskin like the Goinim rather than Rabbeinu Tam as far as the Zmanim goes. And there's also a story that the Alter Rebbe and this author of the Menorah HaTahora, I don't remember his name, they had traveled together to a fundraising trip for Pidyon Shvuim. And so the theory is that this kind of helped the Alter Rebbe formulate his opinion of paskening like the Goinim, not like Rabbeinu Tam. At any rate, it's just an historical tidbit, which I'm curious. Reb Aryeh points out that a Pidyon Haben involves two parties. Now, tongue in cheek, if someone is standing there with 5 sloim and you've got your hand out there, I think the reason why you don't make a bracha on Ben Adam Lachaveirei is perhaps the person is not ready to accept it. Or perhaps you kibbud up, perhaps he's not really appreciating the kibbud which you're giving, that form of kibbud. But if you've got the father of the child, you've got the 5 sloim, and you put your hand out, I think he can, with confidence, say the bracha, and there's no chashash that you're going to walk away and leave the money in his hand. So maybe a yotzim in klal. I wish you all a good tavoch, and we should meet in good health. Kol tov.
Koyach, good tavoch.
Koyach, good tavoch.
Asher koyach, and good tavoch.